The sound of Catherine's bare feet slapping against the hard-packed dirt was drowned out by her thundering heartbeat as she ran through the moonlit desert. Her nightgown torn and bloodied from the mesquite thorns that had snagged her during her desperate flight. Behind her, miles away now, lay the grand house where her husband Charles Bentley, one of the wealthiest cattle barons in the New Mexico territory, would soon discover her missing from the locked bedroom where he had left her after the worst beating of their 3-year marriage. The year was 1878, and Catherine Bentley had finally done what she had contemplated for months. She had fled. The cool night air of early spring stung her tear-streaked face as she stumbled forward, her feet already cut and bleeding, but the pain was nothing compared to the ache of her bruised ribs and the throbbing in her swollen jaw. Charles had been especially cruel tonight, enraged by her speaking to another man at the town social. His jealousy had always been irrational, but tonight it had been murderous. "I will not die at his hands," Catherine whispered to herself, the words a prayer and a promise as she pushed on through the darkness. The light of the 3/4 moon provided just enough illumination to keep her from walking into cacti, but not enough to see the small rocks that cut into her already tender soles. She had no plan beyond escape. No money, no horse, no supplies, just the nightgown on her back and the silver locket containing a small portrait of her mother that she always wore around her neck. Catherine had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a professor who had died when she was 16, leaving her to make her own way. When Charles Bentley had visited from the West, cutting a dashing figure with his wealth and charm, courting her with poetry and promises, she had believed him to be her salvation. How quickly the mask had fallen away after their wedding and the long journey west. The charming suitor had become a possessive, controlling husband, isolating her from the few acquaintances she had made in Santa Fe, monitoring her every move, and finally, when she displeased him, using his fists to ensure her obedience. Catherine stumbled on a rock and fell to her knees, a small cry escaping her lips. For a moment, she stayed there, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. She was miles from town, with no clear direction in the vast New Mexico desert. Dawn would come, and with it the heat of the day. Charles would discover her missing and send men searching. She had no water, no food. "Get up," she commanded herself, forcing her battered body to rise once more. "Keep moving." The sound of running water drew her attention. A small creek, perhaps a miracle in this arid landscape. Catherine changed course, moving toward the sound. Water meant life and perhaps a path to follow. As she drew closer, she could make out the silver ribbon of a narrow stream, and beside it, the dark shape of a small camp. Catherine froze, fear coursing through her. The camp could mean help, but it could also mean danger. Men in this territory were often rough, lawless. As a woman alone, she was vulnerable, but without water and shelter, she would not survive long enough to escape Charles's reach. A soft nickering sound came from near the camp horses. Catherine crept closer, staying in the shadows of the mesquite trees. She could make out a small fire, burning low, and a bedroll beside it. A single figure lay sleeping. Nearby, 2 horses were hobbled, grazing on the sparse vegetation near the stream. Her parched throat made the decision for her. She would take her chances with the stranger. If they proved hostile, she could flee again, but first, she needed water. As quietly as she could, Catherine approached the stream, dropping to her knees at its edge. She cupped her hands and brought the cool water to her lips, drinking deeply, the relief immediate and profound. She splashed some on her face, wincing as it touched the cut on her cheekbone. "I wouldn't move if I were you, madam." The deep voice came from behind her, and Catherine froze, her hands still dripping with water. Slowly, she turned her head. The man from the bedroll stood several feet away, a rifle held casually but purposefully in his hands. In the moonlight, she could make out a tall figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, his face shadowed. "Please," Catherine whispered, her voice rough from fear and thirst. "I mean no harm. I just needed water." The man stepped closer, and the moonlight revealed his features, a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble, eyes that seemed to assess her carefully, and a face weathered by sun and wind. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 or so. "You're hurt," he said, lowering the rifle slightly. "And you're out here alone in your nightclothes." His tone held suspicion but also concern. Catherine nodded, unable to find words to explain her situation. Tears welled in her eyes against her will. The man sighed and set his rifle down against a nearby rock. "The name's Vaughn Calloway," he said, approaching slowly as if she were a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you look like you've been through hell, madam, if you'll pardon my language." "Catherine," she managed. "Catherine Bentley." Recognition flashed in Vaughn's eyes and his expression hardened. "Charles Bentley's wife," she nodded, fear returning at the mention of her husband's name. He will be looking for me by morning." Vaughn Calloway's mouth set in a grim line. "I reckon he will. The question is, do you want to be found?" "No," Catherine said firmly, finding her voice at last. "I would rather die than go back to him." Vaughn studied her for a long moment, taking in her bruised face, her torn nightgown, her bleeding feet. Then he nodded once, decision made. "Let me tend to those feet, Mrs. Bentley. Then we can talk about where you might go from here." Catherine remained tense as Vaughn moved to his saddlebags, pulling out a small kit. He returned and knelt before her, setting a clean cloth beside the stream. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her feet. Catherine hesitated, then nodded, allowing this stranger to examine her injured feet. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so calloused and strong. "You ran through some rough country," he observed, carefully cleaning the cuts. "How far did you come?" "From the Bentley Ranch," Catherine replied. "I'm not sure how far. I've been running for hours." Vaughn let out a low whistle. "That's a good 10 miles of hard country. You're either the bravest or the most desperate woman I've ever met, Mrs. Bentley." "Catherine," she corrected. "Please." I don't want to be Mrs. Bentley anymore." Their eyes met in the moonlight and something passed between them, an understanding. Vaughn nodded slowly. "Catherine, then. I'm a horse trader. I was heading north to Colorado with these 2 mares. He gestured toward the grazing horses. "I can take you with me, away from New Mexico territory, if that's what you want. But your husband is a powerful man with a long reach. It won't be an easy journey." Catherine looked at this stranger, this man who was offering her escape without asking for anything in return, who was tending her wounds with gentle hands, despite the rifle that had been pointed at her moments before. She knew nothing about him beyond his name and occupation, yet in this moment she trusted him more than any man she had known since her father died. "Why would you help me?" she asked softly. Vaughn's hand stilled on her foot. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "I've heard stories about Charles Bentley, about how he treats those under his power." His eyes flickered to the bruise on her jaw. "No one deserves that, and I was raised to believe a man protects those who need protecting." "I have nothing to offer you in return," Catherine admitted. "No money, nothing." "I'm not asking for payment," Vaughn said firmly. "But the journey won't be easy. We'll be traveling rough, avoiding towns where Bentley might have connections." "Can you ride?" Catherine nodded. "My father taught me as a girl. I'm not expert, but I can stay on a horse." "Good. That's a start." Vaughn finished wrapping her feet in strips of clean cloth. "You should rest. We'll leave before dawn." Catherine watched as Vaughn moved about the camp, adding wood to the fire, preparing a simple meal of coffee and jerky. There was something reassuring about his methodical movements, the quiet competence with which he handled each task. When he handed her a cup of the strong black coffee, their fingers brushed briefly, and Catherine felt a jolt of awareness that surprised her. "Thank you," she said, accepting both the coffee and the strip of jerky he offered. "For all of this." Vaughn simply nodded, taking a seat on the other side of the fire. "Get some sleep if you can. I'll keep watch." Catherine knew she should be afraid, alone in the wilderness with a stranger. But exhaustion claimed her, and with her belly warmed by coffee and jerky, she allowed herself to lie down on the blanket Vaughn provided. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Vaughn Calloway's silhouette against the starry sky, his rifle across his knees, standing guard over her first night of freedom. Dawn broke with a riot of colors across the eastern sky. Catherine awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night flooded back her escape, finding Vaughn's camp, his offer of help. She sat up quickly, wincing at the soreness in her body. Vaughn was already awake, saddling the horses. He glanced over at her movement. "Morning," he said simply. "How are the feet?" Catherine gingerly tested her weight on them as she stood. The makeshift bandages had held, and while painful, she could walk. "Better, thank you," she replied. Vaughn nodded, then approached with a bundle of clothing. "These will be too big, but they'll serve better than what you're wearing. I always carry spare clothes for trading." Catherine accepted the bundle, a faded blue shirt, canvas trousers, a leather vest, and a hat. "I'll just—" She gestured vaguely toward a thicket of mesquite trees. "Take your time," Vaughn said, turning back to the horses to give her privacy. Behind the thicket, Catherine stripped off her torn nightgown. In the early morning light, she could see the full extent of the bruises that Charles had left on her body, purple marks on her ribs, fingerprint bruises on her arms. She closed her eyes briefly against the memory, then pulled on Vaughn's clothing. The shirt hung loosely on her slender frame, and she had to roll the trousers several times at the waist and ankles, but the clothes were clean and sturdy. When she emerged, Vaughn gave her an appraising look. "You'll pass for a young man from a distance," he said with approval. "That might be useful." He handed her a knife in a leather sheath. "Keep this with you, just in case." Catherine took the knife, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. It was a tool of self-defense, something Charles would never have allowed her to possess. "Can you teach me to use it?" she asked quietly. Something like respect flickered in Vaughn's eyes. "Yes, I can do that." The camp was quickly packed up, leaving minimal trace of their presence. Vaughn helped Catherine mount one of the mares, a dappled gray with a gentle temperament. "This is Whisper," he said, patting the horse's neck. "She'll take good care of you." Catherine settled into the saddle, adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation after years of riding side saddle as Charles had insisted upon. Vaughn mounted his own horse, a sturdy brown gelding he called Storm, and with a nod they set off northward, away from the rising sun. As they rode, Catherine found herself studying her companion. In the daylight, she could see Vaughn more clearly. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and the kind of strength that came from a life of physical labor. His hair was dark brown, worn longer than was fashionable in town, and his eyes were a striking shade of green that reminded her of the sea near her childhood home in Boston. He had a scar that ran along his jawline, and his hands bore the calluses and small scars of a working man. "Have you always been a horse trader?" she asked after they had ridden in silence for an hour. Vaughn glanced over at her. "No. Fought in the war the Confederate side, though I had no love for their cause. was just a Virginia boy doing what was expected. His voice held no apology but a certain weariness. After I drifted west, tried ranching, mining, even drove cattle for a spell. Found I had a way with horses and a liking for the open country. And no family, Catherine ventured. Lost my parents before the war, no siblings, no wife. He looked at her directly. What about you? Before Bentley, I mean. Catherine told him about her childhood in Boston, her father's position at the university, and how his death had left her with few options. Charles seemed like salvation at first, she admitted. He was visiting Boston on business. He courted me properly, spoke of the beauty of the West, promised me a life of comfort and respect. Her voice turned bitter. The real Charles Bentley only emerged after we were married and hundreds of miles from anyone who knew me. Men like that, Vaughn said grimly, they're good at wearing masks until they have what they want. They rode through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of hardtack and dried fruit from Vaughn's provisions. Catherine found that, despite the discomfort of her injuries and the anxiety of being pursued, there was a growing sense of freedom in the vast landscape around them. The New Mexico territory stretched endlessly, dominated by mesas, painted deserts, and distant mountains that seemed to touch the impossibly blue sky. As the sun began its westward descent, Vaughn led them to a sheltered canyon where a spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a small oasis of greenery. We'll camp here tonight, he decided. Good water, and the canyon walls will hide our fire. They made camp efficiently, with Catherine insisting on helping despite Vaughn's initial protests. She gathered firewood while he tended to the horses, determined to pull her weight. You don't have to prove anything, Vaughn said as he watched her arranging kindling for the fire. Yes, I do, Catherine replied firmly. To myself most of all. Charles made me dependent, helpless. I won't be that woman anymore. Vaughn studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, I'll show you how to build a proper fire then. As darkness fell, they sat beside the small fire, sharing a meal of rabbit that Vaughn had shot along the trail. Catherine found herself relaxing in his company, the tension that had been her constant companion for years beginning to ease. How far to Colorado? She asked. Another week, maybe more, Vaughn replied. We're taking a roundabout route to avoid the main trails where Bentley might have men looking. Catherine nodded, staring into the flames. Do you think I'll ever be truly free of him? Legally, I mean. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. The law favors husbands, he finally said. But there are places where a woman can disappear, build a new life. Colorado's growing fast. Denver, especially. It's not like the small towns where everyone knows everyone's business. A new life, Catherine murmured, testing the words. I hardly know who I am anymore, apart from being Charles Bentley's wife. You're Catherine, Vaughn said simply. The woman who walked 10 miles barefoot through the desert rather than remain under a man's boot. Seems to me you know exactly who you are. Their eyes met across the fire, and Catherine felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. For the first time in years, someone was seeing her not as a possession or an ornament, but as a person of worth and courage. Thank you, she said softly, for saying that. Vaughn looked away, seeming almost embarrassed by the moment of connection. Get some rest, he said gruffly. I'll take first watch. As Catherine settled into her bedroll, she found herself watching Vaughn as he sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees, scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. There was something comforting about his vigilance, yet it was entirely different from Charles's controlling presence. Vaughn was guarding her freedom, not restricting it. With that thought warming her heart, Catherine drifted into the most peaceful sleep she had known in years. The next few days fell into a pattern as they traveled northward. They rode from dawn until dusk, with Vaughn leading them through terrain that seemed designed to confound pursuit. Narrow canyons, dense pine forests as they gained elevation, and high mountain meadows where the view stretched for miles, allowing them to spot any followers. Catherine's body strengthened with each passing day. The cuts on her feet healed, and the bruises Charles had left began to fade. Vaughn taught her practical skills: how to start a fire, how to use the knife he had given her, how to identify edible plants, and how to read the landscape for signs of water or danger. On the fourth night, as they sat beside their small fire in a grove of ponderosa pines, Vaughn finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Why did you run that particular night? What made it different from all the others?" Catherine's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending, one of Vaughn's that had torn during their journey. She was silent for so long that Vaughn began to regret asking. "You don't have to tell me," he said quickly. "It's not my business." "No," Catherine said, her voice soft but steady. "I want to tell you." She set aside the mending and looked directly at him. "That afternoon, I realized I was with child." Vaughn's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hands tightened around the coffee cup he was holding. "It should have been joyful news," Catherine continued. "But all I could think was that this child, this innocent being, would grow up in a house of fear and violence. A son would learn to become like Charles, or be broken by him. A daughter would learn that a woman's lot is to endure a husband's cruelty." She took a deep breath. "When Charles beat me that night, I feared for the baby. Something inside me finally broke, or perhaps it was something finally becoming whole. I knew I had to leave, not just for myself, but for my child." Vaughn was silent for a long moment, processing her words. "Does Bentley know about the baby?" Catherine shook her head. "No, I had only confirmed it myself that day." "Good," Vaughn said firmly. "That gives us an advantage. He's looking for a runaway wife, not a mother with his heir." The way he said "us" warmed Catherine's heart. This man who owed her nothing had somehow made her plight his own concern. "Vaughn," she said hesitantly, "when we reach Colorado, what will you do?" He looked up, meeting her eyes. "That depends on you, I reckon. I can help you get settled somewhere safe, find honest work. Or—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Or I can stay nearby if that's what you want. Keep an eye on things until you're properly on your feet." The offer hung in the air between them. Catherine realized with a start that she didn't want to say goodbye to this man when they reached Colorado. In the short time they had traveled together, he had become more than a rescuer or guide. He had become a friend, perhaps the first true friend she had known as an adult. "I would like that," she said softly. "If you stayed nearby, I mean." Something like relief crossed Vaughn's features. He nodded once, then stood abruptly. "I'll check on the horses," he said, moving away from the fire. Catherine watched him go, aware of a fluttering sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with the child growing within her. It was too soon, she knew, to put a name to these feelings. She was still legally bound to Charles, still running for her life. But for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe in a man's presence, valued for herself rather than as a possession. That night, Catherine dreamed not of pursuit or fear, but of a small cabin surrounded by wildflowers, with mountains in the distance and the sound of a child's laughter on the wind. The following morning brought a shift in the weather. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and a chill wind whipped through the trees as they broke camp. "Storm's coming," Vaughn observed, eyeing the sky with concern. "We need to find better shelter than these trees before it hits." They rode faster that day, pushing the horses as the wind grew stronger and the temperature dropped. By midday, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour that soaked through their clothing despite the oilskin coats Vaughn had produced from his packs. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles ahead," Vaughn shouted over the howling wind. "Used to belong to the Bar X Ranch, but they abandoned it years ago when they sold off this section. It should still be standing." Catherine nodded, too cold and wet to speak. Her hands were numb on the reins, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Pregnancy had made her more susceptible to the cold, and she was fighting waves of nausea as they rode. The rain turned to sleet, stinging their faces and making the rocky trail treacherous. Whisper stumbled once, nearly sending Catherine from the saddle. Only her reflexive grip on the pommel saved her from a fall. "You all right?" Vaughn called back, concern evident in his voice. "Yes," Catherine managed. "Just cold." Vaughn's expression grew grim. He scanned the horizon, then pointed. "There. See that dark shape against the ridge?" Catherine squinted through the curtain of sleet. She could just make out a small, squat building nestled against a rocky outcropping. Relief flooded through her as they urged their horses toward the shelter. The line shack was sturdy but basic, a single room with a dirt floor, a small wood stove, and rough plank walls that kept out most of the wind. A narrow cot stood against one wall, and a crude table with 2 three-legged stools occupied the center of the room. Vaughn quickly unsaddled the horses and led them to a lean-to attached to the back of the shack. It wasn't much protection, but it would keep the worst of the storm off them. Inside, he worked efficiently to start a fire in the wood stove, using the dry kindling he carried in his packs. "Get those wet clothes off," he instructed Catherine, his tone practical rather than suggestive. "Wrap yourself in this." He handed her a wool blanket from his bedroll, then turned his back to give her privacy. Catherine's fingers were so numb that she struggled with the buttons of her borrowed shirt. The wet fabric clung to her skin, making the task even more difficult. After several frustrating attempts, she let out a small sound of distress. "I can't," she admitted, embarrassed. "My hands won't work properly." Vaughn turned, concern etched on his features. He approached cautiously. "May I help? You need to get warm, Catherine. That's not just for your sake now." Understanding his reference to her condition, Catherine nodded, averting her eyes as Vaughn's capable fingers made quick work of the buttons on her shirt. He helped her out of the sodden garment, then immediately wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, preserving her modesty while he continued to help remove her wet trousers. Throughout the process, his touch remained clinical, respectful. Once she was wrapped in the blanket, he retrieved a second one from his pack. "Sit by the stove," he instructed. "I'll hang these to dry." Catherine sank down on one of the stools, drawing the blanket tighter around her shivering body. The small wood stove was beginning to radiate heat, and she leaned toward it gratefully. Vaughn stripped off his own wet clothing without ceremony, wrapping the second blanket around his waist before hanging all their garments on a length of rope he strung across the room. With the immediate tasks taken care of, Vaughn set about making a hot drink, brewing coffee and adding a splash of whiskey from a small flask. "For medicinal purposes," he explained, handing her the steaming cup. "Just a drop. It won't harm the little one, but it'll help warm you faster." Catherine accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around it gratefully. The warmth seeped into her fingers and the first sip spread liquid heat through her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." Again, Vaughn shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. "Storm might last all night." "We'll stay put until it passes." Outside, the wind howled and sleet rattled against the single small window. Inside, the line shack grew warm and almost cozy as the stove heated the confined space. Vaughn prepared a simple meal from their provisions, and they ate in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage. As night fell, the question of sleeping arrangements became unavoidable. The shack contained only the single narrow cot. "You take the cot," Vaughn said firmly. "I'll sleep on the floor by the stove." "You haven't slept properly in days," Catherine protested. "You've been keeping watch while I rest. The floor is cold and hard." "I've slept on worse," Vaughn replied with a half-smile. "Much worse." Catherine bit her lip, then suggested hesitantly, "We could share the cot, just to sleep." She rushed to clarify. "It's small, but we would both be more comfortable than one of us on the floor." Vaughn's expression was unreadable in the dim light cast by the stove. "That wouldn't be proper." "Proper?" Catherine repeated with a small, bitter laugh. "I'm a married woman, running from my husband, disguised as a boy, carrying a child and traveling alone with a man who isn't my husband. I think we left proper behind many miles ago." A reluctant smile tugged at Vaughn's lips. "You make a fair point," he sobered quickly. "But still, your reputation, my reputation, is already in tatters," Catherine interrupted. "And I care far more about your well-being than about theoretical proprieties. You've kept me safe, Vaughn. Let me at least ensure you get a decent night's sleep." After a moment's consideration, Vaughn nodded. "All right, but I'll stay on top of the blankets, you underneath." Catherine agreed to this compromise. They arranged their bedding on the narrow cot and with some awkwardness settled in for the night. Catherine lay with her back to Vaughn, acutely aware of his presence just inches away. Despite the strangeness of the situation, she felt no fear, only a comforting sense of security. "Catherine," Vaughn's voice came softly in the darkness, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about going back to Boston? After the baby comes, I mean. You'd have friends there, maybe family connections." Catherine considered the question. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "But Boston holds few good memories now. My father's colleagues didn't help when he died. And Charles, he found me there once. He could find me again." She was quiet for a moment. "No, I think I need a fresh start, somewhere new where I can build a life on my own terms." "Colorado's a good place for fresh starts," Vaughn said. "Growing fast, full of people looking forward instead of back." "Is that why you were headed there?" Catherine asked. "For a fresh start." Vaughn was silent for so long that Catherine thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "After the war, I couldn't settle, kept moving, taking whatever work came along. But a man gets tired of drifting eventually." He shifted slightly on the cot. "I've saved most of what I've earned these past years, enough to buy a small spread in Colorado, good water, decent grazing. I was on my way to look at a place north of Denver when I found you." "And now," Catherine whispered. "Has that changed?" "Not the destination," Vaughn replied carefully. "Just maybe what I'm looking for when I get there." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Catherine felt her heartbeat quicken, but she didn't press for clarification. It was too soon, too complicated. Instead, she murmured, "I'm glad you found me, Vaughn Calloway." "So am I, Catherine," he replied softly. "So am I." With the storm raging outside and the stove casting a warm glow through the shack, they drifted into sleep, two solitary souls finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. The storm raged through the night and into the following day, forcing them to remain in the lined shack. By mid-morning, their clothes had dried, allowing them to dress properly again. The enforced pause in their journey created an unexpected opportunity for conversation and connection. Vaughn taught Catherine how to play poker using a dog-eared deck of cards he carried in his saddlebags. She proved to be a quick study, her refined Boston upbringing hiding an unexpected competitive streak that made Vaughn laugh out loud when she triumphantly laid down a full house. "You're a natural card sharp," he accused good-naturedly. "Sure you haven't been hustling cowboys in saloons?" Catherine grinned, enjoying the light-hearted moment. "A lady never reveals her secrets, Mr. Calloway." In turn, Catherine taught Vaughn a few words of French, which she had studied as part of her education. He stumbled over the pronunciations, his Virginia drawl transforming the elegant language into something that made Catherine giggle, despite her attempts to be a serious teacher. "I don't think the French would recognize that as their mother tongue," she teased after a particularly mangled attempt at bonjour. "Comment allez-vous?" Vaughn shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Never did have much of a gift for fancy talk. My pa used to say I was better at talking to horses than people." "Were you close, you and your father?" Catherine asked, dealing another hand of cards. Vaughn's expression softened with memory. "Yes, he was a good man, tough but fair. Taught me everything worth knowing: how to ride, shoot, treat a horse right, and respect women." He glanced up at her. "He would have liked you." "I wish I could have met him," Catherine said sincerely. As the day wore on, they shared more stories from their pasts. Vaughn described his childhood in Virginia, his brief time at a small country school before the war took away any chance of further education. Catherine spoke of her father's library, filled with books on philosophy and literature, and how she had devoured them in secret after being told that too much reading wasn't ladylike. "What was your favorite?" Vaughn asked, genuinely interested. "Emerson," Catherine replied without hesitation. "Self-reliance especially. The idea that each person must follow their own path, not one prescribed by society. It gave me courage, even when I wasn't brave enough to act on it." "Sounds like you were storing up that courage," Vaughn observed, "waiting for the right moment." Catherine's hand unconsciously moved to her still flat stomach. "Or the right reason." By evening, the storm had begun to abate, though rain still fell steadily. They prepared another simple meal, working together in the small space with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity. "We should be able to move on tomorrow," Vaughn said as they ate. "Another 5 days to Denver if the weather holds." Catherine nodded, surprised to find herself reluctant to leave the cozy confines of the line shack. These 2 days of enforced proximity had created a bubble of safety and connection that she was loath to abandon for the uncertainties of the trail and the future. "Vaughn," she said hesitantly, "when we reach Denver, what happens then?" He set down his tin plate, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "I have a friend there, Thomas Wilkins, owns a boarding house for respectable women. You could stay there while you decide what you want to do next." He paused. "As for me, I'll look at that property I mentioned. It's about 20 miles outside the city." "And then," Catherine pressed gently. Vaughn met her eyes directly. "That depends on you, Catherine, on what you want." "What if I don't know what I want?" she asked honestly, "other than freedom from Charles." "Then you take the time to figure it out," Vaughn replied. "No rush, no pressure. You're entitled to that much at least." His understanding touched her deeply. Charles had always demanded immediate decisions, immediate compliance. Vaughn was offering her something far more valuable than protection. He was offering her the space to find herself again. "Thank you," she said simply. That night, they once again shared the narrow cot, but something had shifted between them. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a comfortable awareness. Catherine fell asleep to the sound of Vaughn's steady breathing and the diminishing patter of rain on the roof, feeling safer than she had in years. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of easier travel. They packed up efficiently, leaving the line shack as they had found it, save for a small stack of firewood Vaughn chopped to replace what they had used. For the next traveler caught in a storm, he explained when Catherine questioned the extra effort. The next 5 days of travel passed without major incident. They crossed into Colorado territory, the landscape gradually changing from high desert to rolling foothills. Spring was more advanced here, with wildflowers dotting the meadows and fresh green leaves on the aspens. Catherine found herself growing stronger each day. The nausea of early pregnancy subsided somewhat, and she rode with increasing confidence. Vaughn continued to teach her wilderness skills, and she absorbed everything eagerly, determined to be self-reliant. One evening, as they made camp in a sheltered grove, Vaughn presented her with a small revolver. "It's time you learned to shoot," he said. "Every skill you have is one more piece of independence." Catherine took the weapon gingerly. It was smaller than Vaughn's, designed for a woman's hand. "Where did you get this?" "Had it in my pack. Was planning to sell it in Denver, but you need it more." He showed her how to hold it, how to check if it was loaded, and how to aim. "We'll practice tomorrow, away from the horses," he promised. "Just dry firing at first, then with bullets once you're comfortable with the handling." Catherine turned the revolver over in her hands, feeling its weight. Like the knife Vaughn had given her, it represented protection and self-determination, concepts that had been foreign during her marriage to Charles. "I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who carried a gun," she mused. "What kind of woman is that?" Vaughn asked. Catherine considered the question. "Strong, independent, unafraid." "Sounds to me like exactly the kind of woman you are," Vaughn replied, his voice holding a note of admiration that warmed her through. The next day, true to his word, Vaughn took her to a small clearing and patiently taught her to shoot. Catherine was a quick study, her natural intelligence and determination making up for her lack of experience. By the end of their practice session, she was consistently hitting the makeshift target Vaughn had set up on a tree trunk. "You're a natural," he praised. "Better than most men I've taught." Catherine beamed at the compliment, a flush of pride coloring her cheeks. The gun felt less alien in her hands now, more like a tool she could control rather than a frightening object of violence. As they continued their journey, Catherine noticed subtle changes in Vaughn. The reserved horse trader who had first taken her in was gradually revealing more of himself, a dry sense of humor, a surprising knowledge of literature gleaned from books borrowed during his travels, and a depth of compassion that manifested in small, thoughtful gestures. One morning, he presented her with a handful of wild strawberries he had found while checking their perimeter. "For the baby," he said gruffly, looking embarrassed by his own sentimentality. "My ma always said wild berries were good for women in your condition." Catherine accepted the small, sweet fruits with a smile that made Vaughn look away quickly, a flush creeping up his neck. On the 10th day of their journey, they crested a rise and saw Denver spread out below them in the distance, a growing city nestled against the backdrop of the magnificent Rocky Mountains. "There it is," Vaughn said, drawing his horse to a halt beside Catherine. "Denver. End of the trail." Catherine stared at the city, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her: relief at reaching their destination safely, anxiety about what awaited her there, sadness that this journey with Vaughn was coming to an end. "It's beautiful," she said, referring not just to the view but to what it represented, a new beginning. Vaughn glanced at her profile, taking in the strength and determination that had replaced the fear and desperation of the woman he had found by his campfire just days ago. "We'll reach town by nightfall," he said. "I'll take you straight to Thomas's boarding house. It's a respectable place, mainly widows and working women, teachers, seamstresses, and the like. You'll be safe there." Catherine nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment she managed, "And then you'll go to see about your property." Not right away, Vaughn assured her. I'll stay in town a few days, make sure you're settled, help you find work if you want it. What kind of work could I do? Catherine wondered aloud. I've been a student and a wife, nothing else. You're educated, Vaughn pointed out. Could be a teacher or work in a shop. Denver's full of opportunities for someone smart and determined. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought about the future that awaited them in the city below. As they began their descent along the trail, Catherine made a decision. Vaughn, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, before we reach Denver and everything changes. I need to tell you something. He reined in his horse, giving her his full attention. I'm listening. Catherine took a deep breath. These past days with you have been the freest, most honest time of my adult life. You've shown me kindness without expectation, respect without condition. She met his eyes directly. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I care for you, more than I should, perhaps, given my situation. Vaughn's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes softened. Catherine, please let me finish, she interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything. I know I'm still legally married, still carrying another man's child. I know those are complications no man should have to take on, but I couldn't enter Denver without being honest about my feelings. Whatever happens next, you deserve to know that. For a long moment, Vaughn was silent, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. First time I saw you by that stream, bloodied and desperate, something inside me knew my life had changed course. He turned to look at her directly. I told myself I was just helping someone in need, doing what any decent man would do. But that wasn't the whole truth. Catherine held her breath, afraid to hope yet unable to stop herself. The truth is, Vaughn continued, I've come to care for you too, Catherine, more than is wise, maybe. But I've never been known for my wisdom. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I don't know what the future holds either, but I do know I'm not ready to say goodbye to you in Denver. Relief and joy flooded through Catherine. She hadn't realized how afraid she had been of rejection until that fear was lifted. So what do we do? She asked softly. We take it one day at a time, Vaughn replied. Get you settled safe, let you find your feet in Denver, and then. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Then we see what might be possible, when you're truly free to choose your own path. Catherine nodded, understanding the wisdom in his approach. There were legal realities to face, practical considerations about her future and the babies. But knowing that Vaughn saw a possibility for them beyond Denver gave her hope she hadn't dared to nurture before. One day at a time, she agreed. Starting with today. Vaughn smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face and made Catherine's heart skip. Today we ride into Denver, he said. Tomorrow. Well, that's another day. With that, they urged their horses forward, continuing their descent toward the city and whatever future awaited them there. Denver in 1878 was a city of contrasts, elegant brick buildings alongside rough wooden structures. Refined society ladies passing cowboys fresh off the trail. Wealth from mining and railroads, juxtaposed with the struggles of those seeking their fortunes. As Vaughn led Catherine through the bustling streets at dusk, she found herself both intimidated and exhilarated by the energy of the place. The Wilkins boarding house was located in a respectable neighborhood not far from the commercial district. It was a large, three-story Victorian structure with a wide porch and well-tended garden. Thomas Wilkins, Vaughn's friend, proved to be a kindly man in his 50s with a gentle manner that immediately put Catherine at ease. Any friend of Vaughn's is welcome here, he assured her after hearing a carefully edited version of her situation that she was a widow traveling to start a new life. We have a small room available on the second floor. Nothing fancy, but clean and private." Catherine thanked him sincerely, relieved at the prospect of a real bed and proper walls after weeks on the trail. Thomas's wife, Martha, a plump, motherly woman, showed her to the room while Vaughn remained downstairs to discuss arrangements. The room was indeed small but charming, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the garden. Martha provided fresh towels and a pitcher of hot water, promising that breakfast was served at 7 each morning in the dining room downstairs. "The other ladies are a friendly bunch," Martha assured her. "You'll meet them at breakfast. Most work during the day. We have 2 teachers, a seamstress, a clerk at Harrington's department store, and a typist at the newspaper office." Once Martha left, Catherine sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from open wilderness to civilized surroundings. She was still sitting there, lost in thought, when a soft knock came at the door. "Catherine, it's Vaughn." She opened the door to find him standing awkwardly in the hallway, his hat in his hands. He looked strangely out of place indoors, his tall frame and outdoor weathered appearance at odds with the floral wallpaper and polished wood of the boarding house. "I've settled the bill for 2 weeks," he said quietly. "That should give you time to find your feet, maybe secure some work." "Thank you," Catherine replied, touched by his continued care for her welfare. "Where will you stay?" Thomas recommended a hotel nearby. "It's clean enough for my needs." He shifted his weight, seeming reluctant to leave. "I thought, if you're not too tired, maybe we could have supper. There's a decent restaurant down the street, nothing fancy, but the food is good." Catherine smiled, warmed by the invitation. "I'd like that. Let me just freshen up a bit." 20 minutes later, having washed away the dust of the trail and done her best to make her borrowed clothing presentable, Catherine descended the stairs to find Vaughn waiting in the parlor. He had also made an effort. She noted his hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean shirt under his leather vest. The restaurant was indeed simple but welcoming, with checked tablecloths and sturdy furniture. It catered primarily to respectable working people rather than the city's elite, which suited both Catherine and Vaughn perfectly. Over a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, they discussed their plans for the coming days. "I'll need to find work," Catherine said pragmatically. "My funds won't last forever." She had taken only her mother's locket and a small amount of household money when she fled. "What would you like to do?" Vaughn asked. "You mentioned your education. Perhaps teaching." Catherine considered this. "Perhaps. Though I'm not certain how a school would feel about employing a woman in my condition once it becomes apparent." Vaughn frowned slightly. "That's a fair point. What about something you could do from the boarding house? Writing or sewing?" "I'm a decent seamstress," Catherine acknowledged. "Not exceptional, but competent. Charles insisted I maintain the feminine arts, even with servants to do the actual work." Her expression darkened briefly at the memory. "Martha mentioned that one of the boarders works as a seamstress," Vaughn pointed out. "Perhaps she could help you make connections." They continued discussing possibilities, the conversation flowing easily between them despite the changed surroundings. When they returned to the boarding house, Vaughn hesitated at the foot of the porch steps. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," he said. "Maybe show you around the city a bit if you'd like." "I'd like that very much," Catherine replied warmly. For a moment they stood in the soft glow of the porch light, neither quite ready to say good night. Then, with gentle deliberation, Vaughn took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply moving. "Good night, Catherine," he said softly. "Sleep well." "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched him walk away down the gaslit street before entering the boarding house, her heart lighter than it had been in years, despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Catherine settled into life in Denver. True to his word, Vaughn showed her around the city, helping her learn its layout and introducing her to useful contacts. They visited shops, the public library, and the park, gradually expanding Catherine's comfort zone beyond the boarding house. Through Martha Wilkins, Catherine met Eleanor Simmons, the seamstress who also boarded at the house. Eleanor proved to be a godsend, a practical, good-humored woman in her 30s who had established a thriving business creating ladies' clothing. "I have more work than I can handle," Eleanor confided when Catherine inquired about possible employment. "If you truly can so, I'd be happy to pass some simpler jobs your way." Catherine demonstrated her skills, and though Eleanor noted that her technique showed her genteel background, too many tiny, perfect stitches when larger ones would serve just as well, she was impressed enough to offer Catherine regular work. "You can do the finishing work on these walking dresses," she said, producing a bundle of nearly completed garments. "The buttonholes, hems, and trim. I'll pay you by the piece, and if the customers are satisfied, there will be more work." It wasn't exciting labor, but it was honest, and Catherine could do it in the privacy of her room at her own pace. More importantly, it provided her with a small but steady income that would eventually allow her to be truly independent. Vaughn, meanwhile, made the journey to view the property he had been planning to purchase. He returned after 2 days, his eyes alight with enthusiasm as he described it to Catherine over supper at what had become their restaurant. "It's better than I hoped," he said. 20 acres of good land with a year-round creek running through it. Small cabin that needs work but is sound. Previous owner started an orchard, apple and cherry trees that are just coming into maturity. "It sounds wonderful," Catherine said sincerely, enjoying his excitement. "Did you make an offer?" Vaughn nodded. "Sign the papers today, it's mine." There was a quiet pride in his voice that touched Catherine deeply. "Congratulations," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand briefly. "When will you move there?" A shadow crossed Vaughn's face. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. The property needs work before winter comes. I should start soon, but—" He met her eyes directly. "I don't want to leave you alone in Denver." Catherine felt a warm glow at his concern, but she straightened her shoulders. "I appreciate that, Vaughn, truly, but I'm not alone anymore. I have Martha and Thomas, Eleanor, and the other ladies at the boarding house. I have work and a safe place to stay." She smiled gently. "You've given me a foundation for independence. Now I need to build on it." Vaughn studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. You're stronger now, though you were never really weak." He paused. "But I'd still like to check on you. Maybe ride into town once a week." "I'd like that," Catherine replied, relieved that he wasn't suggesting a complete separation. "Very much." They settled into a new routine. Vaughn spent weekdays at his property, working to make the cabin habitable and preparing the land for eventual livestock. Each Saturday, he rode into Denver, staying at the hotel overnight and spending Sunday with Catherine, before returning to his land on Monday morning. These weekend visits became the highlight of Catherine's week. They would walk through the city, visit the market, and sometimes attend lectures at the library or concerts in the park. In the evenings, they would have supper together, talking for hours about books, ideas, and their growing dreams for the future. Catherine flourished under this new arrangement. Her sewing work expanded as Eleanor introduced her to more clients, and her confidence grew with each successfully completed garment. The other ladies at the boarding house became friends, offering advice and companionship. Her pregnancy progressed healthily. though she took care to dress in ways that concealed her condition from casual observers for as long as possible. One Saturday in late July, nearly 2 months after their arrival in Denver, Vaughn arrived with a surprise. Instead of suggesting their usual walk, he asked Catherine to come with him to the livery stable where he kept his horses when in town. "There's something I want to show you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that piqued Catherine's curiosity. At the stable, he led her to a stall where a familiar dappled gray mare greeted them with a soft, nickering sound. "Whisper," Catherine exclaimed, delighted to see the gentle horse that had carried her to freedom. "I didn't know you still had her. I thought you would have sold her by now." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Vaughn said, watching as Catherine stroked the mare's velvety nose. "I kept her because I thought you might want her as your own." Catherine turned to him in surprise. "My own? But Vaughn, she must be worth a considerable sum." "I couldn't possibly. She's a gift," Vaughn interrupted firmly. "She carried you to safety when you needed it most. Seems fitting she should be yours now." He paused, then added more hesitantly, "And I thought, maybe someday you might want to ride out to the property. See what I've been working on." The invitation hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that went beyond a simple visit. Catherine's heart raced as she recognized what Vaughn was really asking if she could see herself as part of the future he was building. "I would like that," she said softly. "Very much." Vaughn's smile was like sunrise breaking across his weathered face. "Then she's yours, and there's something else." From his pocket, he produced a small leather pouch. Opening it, he tipped a gleaming object into his palm, a wedding ring, simple but elegant, with a small sapphire flanked by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "My pa gave it to her when they married, and she gave it to me before she died, said to save it for when I found the right woman." He met Catherine's eyes directly. "I'm not asking anything of you now, Catherine. I know you're still legally tied to Bentley, and there's the baby to consider. But I wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, this is waiting, along with my heart." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes as she looked at the ring nestled in Vaughn's calloused palm. It represented everything she had once dreamed of, but had stopped believing was possible: a marriage based on respect and genuine love, rather than control and fear. "Vaughn," she whispered, unable to find adequate words for the emotions flooding through her. He carefully returned the ring to its pouch. "You don't need to say anything now. I just wanted you to know where I stand. The rest is up to you in your own time." Catherine stepped forward and with gentle deliberation placed her hand against Vaughn's cheek. It was the most intimate gesture she had initiated between them, and she felt him go very still beneath her touch. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For finding me that night, for helping me escape, for teaching me to be strong again. And most of all, for seeing me, truly seeing me when I had almost forgotten who I was." Vaughn covered her hand with his own, turning his face slightly to press a kiss against her palm. The tenderness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes. "You were always strong," he said quietly. "You just needed a chance to remember it." That evening, as they walked back to the boarding house after supper, Catherine made a decision. She had been working toward independence, building a new life for herself and her unborn child. But she realized now that true independence included the freedom to choose connection, to welcome love when it was freely offered without surrendering her hard-won sense of self. "Vaughn," she said as they paused at the foot of the boarding house steps, "I'd like to see your property. Next weekend, if that's possible." His eyes lit up with pleasure and something deeper. "I'll bring a wagon," he promised. "The trail's too rough for you to ride in your condition." Catherine nodded, then added hesitantly, "And I've been thinking about the future." about what might be possible for us. Vaughn waited, giving her space to find her words. "I need to resolve my situation with Charles legally," she continued. "I've spoken with a lawyer Mr. Wilkins recommended. He believes I have grounds for divorce, given Charles's treatment of me. It will take time and it might be difficult, but it's the right path." "I'll support you however you need," Vaughn said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Catherine took a deep breath. "And after that, when the baby comes and I'm legally free, I would very much like to see if your mother's ring fits my finger." The joy that broke across Vaughn's face was like nothing Catherine had ever seen, pure, unguarded happiness that transformed his features and made him look years younger. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. Then, with gentle deliberation, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, a promise, a benediction. "It will fit," he said softly. "I have no doubt about that at all." The next Saturday dawned clear and bright, perfect for the journey to Vaughn's property. True to his word, he arrived at the boarding house with a wagon borrowed from a neighbor. He explained, outfitted with a padded seat for Catherine's comfort and a canvas cover to provide shade. The trip took most of the morning, the wagon following winding trails through rolling foothills that gradually gave way to more rugged terrain. Catherine enjoyed every moment of the journey, relishing the familiar scents of sage and pine and the sight of wildflowers still blooming in protected meadows. When they finally crested a small rise and Vaughn announced, "There it is," Catherine caught her breath at the view before her. A verdant valley stretched below, bisected by a sparkling creek lined with cottonwoods. On a gentle slope overlooking the water stood a cabin, small but sturdy, with a new-looking porch across the front and smoke curling from the stone chimney. Behind it, an orchard of young fruit trees stretched in neat rows, and to one side, a corral contained several horses. "Oh, Vaughn," Catherine breathed. "It's beautiful." Pride and pleasure suffused his features as he guided the wagon down the slope. "It's coming along. Still plenty to do before winter, but it's starting to feel like home." As they drew closer, Catherine could see the results of Vaughn's labor over the past weeks. The cabin had been repaired and expanded slightly, with fresh chinking between the logs and new glass in the windows. A vegetable garden was taking shape beside the house, and a small barn stood beyond the corral. "You've done all this yourself?" Catherine asked, impressed by the amount of work accomplished in such a short time. "Hired a couple of hands from town for the heavy lifting on the barn," Vaughn admitted. "But the rest, yes." He brought the wagon to a halt before the cabin and came around to help Catherine down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, and a small sitting area with a bookshelf already holding several volumes. A doorway led to a bedroom at the back, and a ladder provided access to a loft space above. "It's not fancy," Vaughn said, watching her reaction closely. "Not like what you had in Santa Fe, but it's solid and there's room to expand as needed." Catherine turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's perfect, Vaughn, truly perfect." She gestured to the bookshelf. "You have books?" "Bought them in Denver," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Remembered you mentioned liking Emerson, so I got that one, and some others the bookseller recommended." Catherine crossed to examine the small collection, Emerson's essays, as promised, along with volumes by Thoreau, Whitman, and several novels. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "I love it," she said simply. "All of it." They spent the day exploring the property, with Vaughn proudly showing her the spring that fed the creek, the apple trees that would bear fruit in the fall, and the meadow where he planned to graze cattle eventually. Catherine listened to his plans with growing excitement, increasingly able to picture herself as part of this place, this future. As the sun began to lower in the western sky, they sat on the newly built porch, drinking coffee and watching the changing light on the distant mountains. "What do you think?" Vaughn asked quietly. "Could you see yourself here? You and the little one." Catherine looked out over the peaceful valley, then at the man beside her, this good, honorable man who had rescued her from despair and helped her reclaim her strength and dignity. "Yes," she said with quiet certainty. "I can see us here very clearly." Vaughn's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with easy familiarity. In that moment, with the golden light of evening surrounding them and the promise of a shared future before them, Catherine felt a peace she had never known, the peace of being exactly where she belonged. The months that followed were busy ones for both Catherine and Vaughn. Catherine's legal proceedings to obtain a divorce from Charles began, a process her lawyer warned would be neither quick nor simple. Charles Bentley's influence extended even to Colorado, and when served with the divorce papers, he responded with fury and threats. "He claims I abandoned him without cause," Catherine told Vaughn one evening in early September, her voice tight with anger and worry. "He's demanding I return to New Mexico territory immediately." Vaughn's expression darkened. "That's not going to happen, not while I draw breath." Catherine touched his arm reassuringly. "My lawyer is confident. We have witnesses from Santa Fe who will testify to Charles's cruelty, servants who saw my injuries, the doctor who treated me once when the beating was particularly severe." She sighed. "It's humiliating to have these private matters made public, but it's the only way." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Vaughn said firmly. "The shame is all his." Despite the stress of the legal battle, Catherine's life in Denver continued to improve. Her sewing work expanded beyond finishing Alina's projects to creating her own designs, particularly for expectant mothers who appreciated garments that were both practical and attractive. Her pregnancy was now visible, and while it raised some eyebrows at the boarding house, Martha Wilkins steadfastly supported her, silencing gossip with a firm reminder that Mrs. Bennett's circumstances are her own business. Vaughn, meanwhile, continued to develop his property, adding to the cabin and preparing for winter. His weekly visits to Denver remained the highlight of Catherine's week, though now they often included practical discussions about the future, what additional rooms the cabin might need, how to arrange for a midwife when the time came, whether to plant more fruit trees in the spring. In late October, as Catherine entered her 7th month of pregnancy, a telegram arrived that changed everything. Her lawyer, Mr. Harrison, requested her presence at his office immediately. Alarmed, Catherine sent a message to Vaughn, who fortunately was in Denver for his weekly visit, asking him to meet her there. Mr. Harrison's news was unexpected but welcome. "Charles Bentley is dead," he announced without preamble when Catherine and Vaughn were seated in his office. "Shot in a saloon dispute in Santa Fe 3 days ago." Catherine sat in stunned silence, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her: relief, a lingering fear that somehow it wasn't true, and a strange, unexpected flicker of grief for the man Charles had once pretended to be. "Are you certain?" Vaughn asked, his hand finding Catherine's and holding it firmly. "Quite certain," Mr. Harrison replied, producing a newspaper clipping from Santa Fe that detailed the incident. Apparently, Mr. Bentley accused another patron of cheating at cards. The dispute escalated, guns were drawn, and Mr. Bentley was killed instantly. "What does this mean for Catherine's situation?" Vaughn asked, practical as always. "It simplifies matters considerably," the lawyer explained. "Instead of a divorce, Mrs. Bentley is now a widow. There will be legal matters to address regarding Mr. Bentley's estate, but as his lawful wife, Mrs. Bentley is entitled to a portion of his property, regardless of the circumstances of their separation. Catherine shook her head. I want nothing from him, nothing but my freedom. Mr. Harrison smiled gently. I understand, Mrs. Bentley. But consider the child you carry. Any inheritance would legally belong to them as much as to you. He's right, Catherine, Vaughn said quietly. The money could provide security for the baby's future, education opportunities. After further discussion, Catherine agreed to let Mr. Harrison proceed with a claim against Charles's estate on behalf of her unborn child. The process would take time, but the immediate result was clear. Catherine was now legally free to build a new life. As they left the lawyer's office, Catherine stopped on the sidewalk, overwhelmed by the implications of the news. I can hardly believe it, she murmured. All these months of fear, of looking over my shoulder, and now. Now you're free, Vaughn finished, his eyes warm as they met hers. Truly free to choose your own path. Catherine looked up at him, this man who had found her at her lowest moment and helped her rise, who had offered support without demands and love without conditions. I've already chosen, she said softly. If you'll still have me, Vaughn Calloway, I'd like to claim that ring you showed me. Vaughn's face lit with joy. Nothing would make me happier, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But are you sure? You don't need more time to think. Catherine shook her head firmly. I've had months to think, to be sure. I love you, Vaughn. I want to build a life with you, raise this child with you, perhaps have more children together, grow old on that beautiful land you're nurturing. In response, Vaughn reached into his pocket and produced the leather pouch he had carried every day since showing her his mother's ring. With steady hands, he took out the ring, and right there on the Denver sidewalk, with passers-by moving around them, he knelt before her. Catherine, he said, his green eyes holding hers with steady devotion, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, Catherine replied without hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. With all my heart, yes. Vaughn slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, just as he had predicted. Then he rose and, mindful of her condition and their public location, placed a gentle, reverent kiss on her lips, their first kiss, sweet with promise and the certainty of a shared future. 3 weeks later, they were married in a simple ceremony at the Wilkins boarding house. Martha had insisted on hosting, and Thomas proudly gave Catherine away. Alina created a beautiful wedding dress that accommodated Catherine's growing belly while making her look radiant rather than merely pregnant. The other boarders attended, along with a few friends Vaughn had made in Denver and the neighboring ranchers who had helped him with his barn. The ceremony was brief, but deeply moving. Catherine and Vaughn had written their own vows, promises of respect, partnership, and enduring love that brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic guests. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn's kiss was tender but thorough, bringing a blush to Catherine's cheeks and good-natured cheers from the assembled friends. The following day, Vaughn brought Catherine home to their land, now officially their land, as he had added her name to the deed as a wedding gift. Winter was approaching, but the cabin was snug and well prepared, with a root cellar stocked with preserved foods and a woodpile that would see them through the coldest months. "Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway," Vaughn said as he carried her across the threshold, mindful of her advanced pregnancy but unwilling to forego the tradition. "Home," Catherine repeated, savoring the word and all it represented. Not the grand house in Santa Fe that had been her prison, but this simple cabin filled with love and the promise of a future built together. The winter passed peacefully, with occasional trips into Denver for supplies and visits from neighbors curious about the new Mrs. Calloway. Catherine and Vaughn settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both, their companionship deepening into a partnership of equals. Catherine added feminine touches to the cabin curtains she sewed herself, a quilt for their bed, herbs growing in pots by the kitchen window, while Vaughn continued to improve the property, building furniture for the baby's arrival and planning spring plantings. In late January, during a week of heavy snow that left them happily isolated, Catherine went into labor. Vaughn had prepared for this possibility, studying a midwifery book and arranging the cabin for the birth. Despite his outward calm, his hands trembled slightly as he helped Catherine through the long hours of labor, offering encouragement and support with steady devotion. After 16 hours, their daughter was born, a healthy, strong-lunged girl with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into a shade somewhere between Catherine's blue and Vaughn's green. They named her Hope, a testament to the feeling that had sustained them through their journey from that desert campsite to this moment of new beginning. As Catherine nursed their daughter beside the crackling fire, Vaughn sat beside them, his weathered face soft with wonder as he watched the tiny girl who had made them a family. "She's perfect," he murmured, gently touching Hope's small fist where it rested against Catherine's breast. "She is," Catherine agreed, looking up at her husband with eyes luminous with love and gratitude. "And so is this our life, our home, our future together." Vaughn leaned forward to press a kiss to her forehead, then to the top of his daughter's downy head. "When I found you by that stream," he said softly, "I never imagined this, never dared to hope for such happiness." "Nor did I," Catherine replied. "That night I was running away from something terrible. I had no idea I was actually running towards something wonderful." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their land in pristine white. Inside, the small family remained wrapped in the warmth of their love and the promise of all the days to come, days that would bring challenges and joys, growth and change, but always the unwavering certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they needed: strength, respect, partnership, and a love that had been worth every barefoot step of the journey. 5 years later, the Callaway Ranch had flourished beyond their early dreams. The original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable home with room for their growing family Hope, now a spirited 5-year-old with her mother's determination and her father's love of the outdoors, had been joined by 3-year-old twins, James and William, who kept Catherine and Vaughn on their toes with their adventurous spirits. The inheritance from Charles Bentley's estate had eventually been settled, providing a trust for Hope's education and allowing Vaughn to expand their holdings and increase their herd of cattle. The orchard now produced abundantly, and Catherine had developed a small business selling preserves and baked goods in Denver, where they traveled monthly for supplies and to maintain their friendships with the Wilkins and Alina, who had married a local shopkeeper the previous year. On the anniversary of the day Vaughn had found Catherine by his campfire, they made a tradition of a special dinner after the children were asleep. This year, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple, Catherine rested her head on Vaughn's shoulder, content in the life they had built together. "You ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "About how differently things might have turned out if I had run in another direction, or if you had camped elsewhere?" Vaughn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our children, at this land, at you, and I think perhaps it wasn't chance at all." Catherine smiled, turning to press a kiss to her husband's weathered cheek. "Perhaps not. Perhaps it was exactly where we were both meant to be, you with your campfire, me with my bare feet and desperate courage." "Not just courage," Vaughn corrected gently. "Hope." Even then, you were running toward something, not just away. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Catherine Calloway looked out over the home and family that had seemed impossible 6 years ago when she fled into the night. From desperate escape to profound belonging, her journey had brought her here to this man, this land, this life built on love and respect. Yes, she agreed, her voice soft with gratitude for all they had found together. I was running toward home. I just didn't know it yet.